Good morning, everyone. I'm Katie Resendez, and I'm the Director of Children's Ministry here at UUC Phoenix. I think I'll start by telling you some announcements, and then I'll tell you a story. Miss Mary mentioned that there are classes today. Little Justice Leaders has been happening on Sunday mornings before service, and we have two classes that start up. One is called 345 Zoom, and it's really open for anyone 2 to 6 years old. And then the other is called Faithful Journeys, and it's open for anyone 5 to 12 or 13 years old. But anyone is welcome to join us. And today I'll be teaching them. And I won't teach every session because I'm going on sabbatical, which means I'll be away for about 2 months. But I wanted to see some of you all before I left. So feel free to drop in and we'll tell some stories and we'll talk about a road and a path and a map and transitions and changes. Because that's what today is about. Being peaceful through transition. And I have a story that has a road in it. It's just one road, and it's fairly straight, got a few winds and curves, but it goes up a huge hill. So I want you to start by imagining that huge hill and that road that goes up it. It's a rocky road, dirt, not paved. When Trey was a child, Trey worked very hard to be a good family member. Did chores, helped with their family animals, helped cook, helped clean, helped build things, learned as many skills as they could. And then a war came and Trey was in the military, and that was hard and that was scary. And there were all sorts of things about not being your full self because you had to be a soldier and you had to be a soldier all the time. You couldn't be a good cook. You couldn't be good at taking care of animals. You couldn't sew well because you were busy being a soldier. It was very, very important. And as some wars do, the war ended. And as some soldiers do, Trey got to go back home. But things had changed, and Trey's younger siblings were doing a lot of the chores Trey had always done. And even though they were just a young teenager, it seemed like the expectations were shifted and people lived in different places and the house seemed different. And Trey felt a little lost and a little stuck at the same time. It was weird to feel like they didn't know what it meant to be Trey, and at the same time, they felt stuck in being Trey. So Trey sat and thought and thought and thought, and thoughts became meditation, and meditation became prayer. And it came to Trey. I need to be stronger. And so he wanted to be stronger. And he said, okay, the strongest people I know are the 3 old grandmothers who live at the base of that huge hill. Or rather, they keep a barn at the base, but their house is up at the top. But they are so strong. They are muscly. They have lived so long. They've survived many wars. And they've taken care of this whole community, not to mention themselves. I'll go and ask them. So Trey walked to the base of that hill and saw that those 3 grandmothers were working in the barn. He could hear sounds, grunts, things moving around, and it smelled kind of awful. And Trey had never really worked in a big barn, but he went in. Grandmother? Hello? Grandmothers? Can I talk to you? And so Trey laid out his entire struggle. I want to be stronger. Well, and you see, Trey, like many young people, didn't notice what was going on when he walked into that barn. He just said, can I talk to you? Here's my story. And those 3 grandmothers, being kind and being able to do more than one thing at once and not wanting to bicker with the boy, had listened. But what Trey didn't notice was that they were in the middle of helping an ox be born. That little baby ox was about this big, which is not very little for a baby, but for an ox it is, and was still wet and making funny little sounds. And they said, well, young man, help us by washing this ox. And he washed it and wrapped it in a blanket. And the oldest of the grandmothers said, well, now that you're holding it and it seems so very cold and its mother won't be able to take care of it, we need to bring it up the hill to the house. We'll start a warm fire. Would you like to carry the wood or the ox?" And Trey looked in his arms and said, "Well, it's already bundled up and it is very sweet looking. I'll carry it up the hill." And so he set out from the barn to carry the ox up that big hill. And to be honest, he knew the hill was big, but it was a lot bigger while carrying an ox. He carried it up, was able to settle it down in the kitchen of the house, right next to the fire, kept it warm for a little bit, and then said, "Grandmothers, do you think you will be able to help me?" And they said, "Of course. Of course we can, and we already have, but come back tomorrow morning." Trey was a little confused, but being lost and feeling untethered, decided to just go along with it. Walked back down that big hill. It was so steep, it wasn't even much easier to walk down than it was to walk up, always being worried about stumbling and knees hurting and the rocks falling down. Trey went home and slept. The next day, he met the grandmothers at the barn, and he helped around the barn doing various chores, various things. And of course, he was constantly distracted by that little baby ox. And it was time for the day to end. The grandmother said, "Will you again carry that ox up the hill?" Trey said, "Of course." Bundled the ox up, carried it up that hill. The hill seemed less steep. The ox was so sweet. It felt good to go to the farm every day. It felt good to work with those 3 old grandmothers. He was always surprised by how strong they were, how they kept just pushing through, what good farmers they were. They loved taking care of their animals. They loved taking care of the land. And every day, Trey would carry that little ox up the hill. Now this went on and on. Went from the time that the ox could be carried just like this, to when Trey had to put it under its arm, to slinging it over his arm, to eventually carrying the ox like this over his neck and lugging it up the hill. But the thing is, it never felt like it got much harder to carry that ox. And yes, the ox could walk up and down the hill by itself and didn't need to sleep in the house anymore. But it was the time each day that Trey gave to this thing that he loved. And they walked, and as he would walk the ox up the hill, he would sing to it. And sometimes they would just walk right back down again. But it was giving that moment and that time that helped Trey feel tethered again. Not just connected to the ox or to the grandmothers or to town, but also to himself. And the other thing he realized was that the ox was huge now, and he could still lift it. How could that possibly be? And he looked at the grandmothers and thought to himself, "I'm not as strong as them. I'm not as old and as wise. And my muscles certainly aren't as... My muscles are huge. I've changed. I look different. I'm stronger. I definitely feel different. I'm connected." I hadn't even noticed the transition. And he walked into the paddock of the barn where the 3 grandmothers were drinking tea, sitting around, looking at their animals. And he said, "You know what's funny? I've completely changed, and I didn't really have to do anything about it. It just happened." The grandmothers laughed and laughed and laughed at him. And the middle one said, "You've always been a fool, Trey." "A fool?" And the youngest grandmother said, "Why, yes. Of course you did the change. That very first day, when you walked into the barn and decided to ask for help, that was a change." And the oldest grandmother said, "Even back before that, the day that you sat down and decided to think and think and think about who you wanted to be and what you needed, that was a change." And the middle grandmother said, "No, it was the day when you were given the option to come back home to your town and your family, and you chose to do that. That was when you changed." Trey thought, I didn't know those were changes. I thought I was just doing the next thing." And the 3 grandmothers looked at Trey and said, "The next thing is always a change from doing nothing. And Trey was still a young man. And Trey still had lots of muscles and loved to do farm work. So that sentence, doing the next thing is always a change from doing nothing, didn't really quite sink in. But all those days spent on the farm and all that time lugging that ox up and down the hill and all those muscles stayed with Trey. And he was able to figure out exactly who he was, even if just for that moment, until the next thing came along. I love you so very much. You are very, very loved, and you are very powerful. Maybe you can lug oxes up and down a hill. Maybe you can read books and remember them beginning to end. Or maybe you're just really good at checking in with someone and making sure they're okay. Whatever it is, you are powerful and you are so, so very loved. And I will see you in 2 months.